everybody. Once again, welcome to another Clark Environmental Fun with the Environment. I brought in a good friend of mine today, Dave from SurvTech. Dave O'Brien is the owner, president, the whole works. And what I wanted to do was finally a show that interests me. Dave's going to talk about LIDAR, what it is, how it came about. I saw a show on TV on the Discovery Channel, and Dave and I have talked about it. I got really interested in it, so I've asked him to come in and talk about it. Dave, how are you, sir?
Thank you, Jim, for the introduction. I appreciate that. And I'd like to really start with LIDAR, with the fact that I think people are starting to realize, or at least understand or hear the term, so most people are like, well, LIDAR, that makes sense to me. And I want to go back, geez, I'm dating myself here, 30 years to when I was in college, and I would say the same thing about GPS. You know, I was working with GPS to do positioning for mapping and getting precise, positions on the Earth. And we'd have to go out in the middle of the night because the constellations were only up at nighttime and so forth. And nobody knew what it was. But now, if you ask somebody about GPS, yeah, it's in my phone, it's in my automobile. Shoot, your toaster may have GPS and know where it is on the Earth. So LIDAR is going to very quickly become the same as GPS. Right now, not a lot of people know about it. Interestingly, as you talked about earlier, it's been around for quite some time. It was invented in the 60s, and I think, it was more of, I want to say they used it to track the distance of satellites or something like that, and it was more of a single beam type thing. In recent years, and as early as the 90s, I think my LIDAR guys started working with aerial LIDAR around 1997, and they put it in airplanes. Now, let's drop back a little bit and talk about LIDAR. LIDAR is using, it's light, distance, and ranging. So it's using light to determine distance. And it's very precise, very accurate, can be as accurate as sub-millimeter, matter of fact.
Wow.
Yeah, it's accurate, but from a mapping point of view, the only way you can get real accuracy is if you know the position of where the LIDAR starts from. So for example, if the LIDAR is a stationary unit, you can obviously get very precise measurements. But if the LIDAR unit is moving, you have to position that LIDAR head, and more than position it. You have to know the location of it, but you have to know the orientation of it. So I'm sure all of you have been on a boat or been in an airplane. So when you're on a boat or an airplane, there's what they call heave, pitch, roll. You're going like this. And so imagine a LIDAR unit sitting on the bottom of it, and it's shooting out lasers that are measuring the ground. Well, if your airplane's going like this, all the laser beams are going in all different directions. So LIDAR is extremely accurate, but up until recent years, they couldn't really solve for those changes in position quickly enough to calculate real accurate positions below. So they've had it on airplanes for a while, but the first place surveyors started using it, and I'm a surveyor, not an aerial mapper. I'm an aerial mapping company now because we've had it in an airplane. Right around the same time, 1997 and 98, you've all seen tripods, like survey tripods, or like the tripod that's holding the camera there. It's a three-legged instrument they use to set something on and keep it stable. Well, the first LIDAR units were called 3D scanners. Okay. Also terrestrial LIDAR, because terrestrial means on the ground. And they would set a LIDAR unit on top of that. Now it's very accurate because it's set on a stationary point that you can put a coordinate on the ground and you can measure up a height to the center of the LIDAR unit. So you know where that X, Y, and Z are. If you remember your mathematical coordinate systems from high school.
And whoever said math wasn't important.
Well, it's very important to LIDAR. So the early LIDAR sitting on a tripod would sit in the middle of this room and it would just spin slowly, measuring up and down. And it would probably measure, I think the early time of flight LIDAR measured, probably a couple thousand points a second. And so it would just scan this room and just slowly tick around scanning this room. But what you would get is a very accurate point cloud made of just points, X, Y, Z positions of everything in this room. Now you wouldn't have color with that, you would just have intensity values. So when the light went out, see the black vending machine, for example. What does black do? It absorbs light. So certain types of LIDAR do not like black. So if you try to do brand new pavement from an airplane, some sensors handle it very well, some won't pick up anything. So black is the one thing, if it absorbs the whole laser and doesn't get the return, then you can't measure to it. So, but it would slowly move around this room and it would measure everything in this room, including me and you. If it's set in the middle of the room, including Brandy, everybody would be measured. And so at that point, you have millions and millions of points, and if points are so close together, you can't see the space between them. You now have what is a 3D virtual representation of a solid. Even though it's made up of millions and millions of points, if they're just micromillimeters apart, it looks like solid figures.
Gotcha.
Okay. And so the closer you are to the LIDAR unit, the denser that is, the more solid it looks. The further away you get from the LIDAR unit, the points spread out, because as they go away, an angle gets what? The further it goes, it gets bigger as it diverges. So if you have a LIDAR unit and you push it past this range, you may not actually get a 3D point cloud of everything. You'll just get a point here, a point here, a point here, and you really can't fill in what's in between. But let's talk about some of the basics of LIDAR for a minute. For example, I think you asked me earlier about water.
Yeah.
Because everybody's like, they have bathymetric LIDAR now. And yes, they do. They have it in airplanes. But a typical LIDAR sensor, a regular LIDAR sensor, is about $1 million for an airplane.
Wow.
Yeah. And so the bathymetric LIDAR is about $4 million. And it only likes very clear water. So it works very well down at the Keys. The further you come north and the water gets murkier, it becomes more useless. It just doesn't, it won't penetrate murky water.
Gotcha.
So people always want a quick way to measure water bodies. They always say bathymetric LIDAR, but at this point in time, it does exist, but you need really clear water, and it only works in optimal conditions. Now, may they get around that? Yes. So what I always tell people is LIDAR, truly the LIDAR that we use most of the time, hates water. So if you have a puddle, it will not penetrate the puddle. So you'll have a black area in your map that doesn't have any points. So it's just an area you don't have points.
Is that how you can tell that there's water there?
Yes. That's how you tell there's water there. Because if there's either water there or something very black absorbing the light.
The, say, depth, is there a certain depth that will go down to? It just has...
No, not when it's regular LIDAR. It does not like water. If it's bathymetric LIDAR, it'll typically go 1.5 times Secchi disk depth. So you know what a Secchi disk is?
Mm-hmm.
It's that disk you put in the water.
You can see it tells you how deep you
Yeah,
are.
and you can measure and see if when you lose sight of it, that's 1 Secchi disk depth. So from what I'm told, because we don't have a bathymetric LIDAR sensor, but typically 1.5 times that depth.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can see 6 feet, you can typically get LIDAR at 9 feet. But if it's black water, like in a murky pond or something, you're probably not going to get anything. Now, when it's LIDAR that we're using, it just hates water. So if it comes across water, it's not going to pick it up. So when my guys are flying in the airplane and they're mapping thousands of square miles, because that's what they do, yeah, thousands of square miles, if it's at a rain event, they typically won't fly for 48 hours. Because the puddling, the water on the ground will make a lot of loss of data. So they'll usually wait and fly. So there is a technology that's used for underwater 3D mapping that looks just like LIDAR. So that's what I wanted to bring that up and say, everybody's like, well, can you map underwater in 3D high definition point cloud? It looks like LIDAR. It's called multi-beam sonar. And so if you know what sonar stands for sound,
Mm-hmm.
so it's a sound, but it sends out an array of sound, and we get a 3D point cloud of what's underwater. So
You guys do that also?
yes, we do that also, and it's at this point in time, it's not as high definition of LIDAR, but for example, we did a berth at the port the other day with multi-beam, and you could see tires sitting down there, you can see concrete blocks, so it's not as dense as maybe LIDAR would be, but it's very, very close. You're picking up good size objects. You can see piles, vertical piles and so forth, so.
The only reason I bring that up is down in Inglewood, where Beth and I have a place, it was probably about 2 miles north of us, 15 feet of water. They were figuring 15,000 years ago, the water level was down below that. There was an Indian burial ground. And it was peat moss, and what they've done is cordoned it off, and I think National Geographic is down there. So that wouldn't have been LIDAR though, that would have been the sonar.
That would probably be, and there's two different types of things. If you want real accurate bathymetry, real good depth data,
Mm-hmm.
like LIDAR gives you real good positional data, you have to use multi-beam. But there's something called side scan, which is more of a picture. It takes like a really pretty picture, but there's no bathymetry with it.
Okay.
But if you were looking, it's high definition. So it doesn't give you depth, but if you were looking for a body or a shipwreck or a structure, then side scan is actually a better picture of what's down there, but there's no accurate measurements on it. You don't have bathymetry data, how deep it is, and the depth of it. It's more of a picture. But it is sonar, it's not a picture, it's actual sonar. So back to LIDAR, a lot of people are under the misconception, probably at this point in time, that LIDAR only exists, well, I think most people hear about it on airplanes. Because a lot of people approach me and they say, have you heard about, the Incas, the Aztecs, the Mayans down in South America, and it's heavy jungle down there because it's the rainforest, and so it's real thick canopy. The most awesome thing about LIDAR, I don't know if it's the most, but one of the greatest things about LIDAR is, and the reason it helps surveyors so much, to this day, one of the toughest things to survey is a heavily vegetated area. Why? Because it just takes a lot of manpower to cut with machetes and axes and chainsaws through vegetated areas. But LIDAR, because it sends out so many points, millions and millions of points, that those little holes in tree canopies, any holes, it'll find its way through. So some of them will hit branches below, some of them will hit trees below, but some of it gets to the natural ground below, the topography. And so that's where the people looking for lost cities in the jungle, it comes in, handy because, and I asked my guys when we first got LIDAR, well, how do you know you're on natural ground? I understand the LIDAR gets through holes, but what if it's hitting a branch here and a mountain here? They said, Dave, we get such density of data. So the new drones that we're flying are getting upwards of 150 points per square meter. So if you have a square meter,
Wow.
It's getting 150 points. Now, if we're flying vegetation, only 30 or 40 of those points may get through to natural ground, but it's still 30 or 40 points. So they said what we do is we look at the data. Once we rip off the vegetation with filters and so forth, they filter it off. And if the data at the ground is real thin, like less than 1/10 of a foot, they're pretty sure they're on natural ground. See, all those points agree with each other. But if they have thick data, where the points, the data, this point's here, this point's a foot higher, then they think, yeah, we're probably not seeing natural ground. Branch, trees, shrubs. And so what I tell my clients is, man, high canopy, like pine groves, like the flatwoods that they have here in Florida, no problem. Things that LIDAR doesn't like is palmetto bushes. It's very dense at ground level, so it's very hard to get through. Or that Kogan grass. Have you ever seen that Kogan grass? It's that invasive species. It's very thick. It's like 3 feet tall. The accuracy of our LIDAR tends to drop from 1/10 of a foot to 2 or 3/10 with Kogan grass, and because it just can't penetrate all the way through. It's not. That's what I tell people. If you're mapping thousands of acres in not 20 minutes, in one day instead of weeks, if you can deal with a few tenths of a foot rather than 1/10 of a foot, it's not bad.
So let me jump in here that the reason why I got interested in this was, like I said, I watched this National Geographic show with a guy by the name of Albert Lynn, and they were doing it on the Mayan Snake Kings. And they showed the plane going over the jungle down there, and then they did the LIDAR all over it, brought it back, and all of a sudden they found that there were 60,000 more buildings there, and the population went from 1.2 to 20 million people. And they showed it on this huge screen where you could see the temples, you could see, and actually he had a laptop with all the data in there, and they're walking, he goes, over there is a temple, small, 20 feet high, and you looked, there was nothing but vegetation, and as you got closer, you could see it. And that's why I asked you to come in here, because I thought this was fascinating.
So how do you think they're doing that? So the one thing about nature is, most of the time, nature doesn't make straight lines and right angles. So once they fly the LIDAR over, and some of it penetrates to what's below that canopy, and they filter that off with algorithms, they take off the vegetation, and that's over my head. That's computing guys that know how to do really smart math and programming. But they filter off the vegetation, and now they can actually see foundations. I mean, you're talking about actually seeing the buildings still there, but even just a foundation. Like we flew a site at the Port of Tampa at Port Red Wing a couple of years ago, and I mean, from the aerial, it looks like just a big wooded area. And then once we flew LIDAR, you could see this old rectangular foundation. So there was obviously something there years ago. I don't know what, but my field crews probably wouldn't have even picked that up because they would have cut just straight lines through on a grid, and they would have just took elevation shots. They probably wouldn't even have noticed the foundation unless one of them tripped over it or something. You know what I'm saying? So LIDAR gives you it gives you ability to kind of strip off that vegetation and see what's below. But that's only one type of, so aerial LIDAR on a plane is one type.
Okay.
LIDAR on a UAV, same theory. I mean, you're on a UAV, that's another type. But you have to know that LIDAR is now on automobiles. It's actually used for a lot of indoor mapping, so it's on tripod still, much quicker than it was in the early days. And it's on actually backpack units and backpack units and even push carts now that you can wheel around and hand map relatively quickly. And so you, as somebody that's not a surveyor, you may not think anything about this, but anytime you have movement or you need accurate LIDAR, you need to know the position of the head of the LIDAR unit. Like I said, on an airplane, that thing's going through space, you know, a couple hundred miles an hour, and it's moving, hitting pitch and roll. So GPS will give you the XYZ of the center of that, because you'll have an offset to an antenna that's calced. It's a lever out, it's all math. And so you can calc the XYZ of it, but how do you calc that it's now looking this way because you've hit a wind gust and the plane's crabbed, you know, or tilted. And so they have something called an inertial measurement unit. So it actually measures acceleration. So the IMU, inertial measurement unit, combined with GPS correct each other. So 1,000 times a second, the GPS is reporting position and the IMU is reporting orientation. Thousands of times a second. Think about that. And the LiDAR is shooting millions of points, and it's all time synced. So at this fraction of a second, it knows the LiDAR head is pointing this direction. At this fraction of a second later, it knows it's pointing at this direction, and it knows the plane's further down. And so they get this dialed in so tight that from our airplane now, we're getting 1/10 of a foot accuracy from, and don't quote me on this because I'm not the pilot and the aero guys, but I think they're flying, 10 or 12,000 feet in the air.
And 1/10 of a foot.
Think about that, because if you're off just a little tiny bit up here, when you get 8,000 or 10,000 feet down, that error is multiplied exponentially. So it's truly amazing. Now every LiDAR system is a little different. Some actually have a mirror in an airplane that swings side to side, and so they have to correct for the mirror coming and slowing down, and then starting in the other direction, and doing that millions of times a second. So the mirror is speeding up, slowing down, speeding up, slowing down, and that's all corrected for. Or they have a rotating mirror that just goes 360 degrees, and obviously it doesn't get any LiDAR when it's looking back up into itself. That seems in my head to make it a little bit easier than trying to figure out slowing, speeding up. And then
Now I know why they're $1 million a piece.
Yeah, it's a big deal. It really is.
Wow.
So you have that on the airplane, you have that on the UAV. So now you have GPS, the IMU. So when you're on a car, you have the same thing. If you have an automobile, you have the automobile correcting for the car hitting the bump, driving. If you're on a boat, the same thing, heat, pitch, and roll. But how do you do that inside a building without GPS? And see, there's always been the rub. So you've got no GPS, you got no position. Now you got IMUs, but what IMUs do is drift over time. So they're real good at correcting heat, pitch, and roll, but you'll find over time, if you start here and you go to the door, well, the IMU will slowly drift away from where its actual position is. And that's why the GPS is great, because it actually keeps correcting the IMU up as it moves along. And so the two together work really well. But now if you want to scan inside the building, the only way to do it is you can set up on a tripod and scan, and then you leapfrog, and you scan, and then you relate the next scan to the past scan. So the overlapping point clouds, use that to link the two scans together. And so if you don't overlap, you've lost your position.
Right.
They're out in space. So people wanted a way to do it motionless, with movement, kinematically, and not have to do a tripod. So we're actually one of the leaders in that. We have both a backpack and a cart that you push around, but it's actually, they have it's called the SLAM algorithm, SLAM, and it stands for simultaneous localization, and so simultaneous localization and movement, I believe. But it's really unique because usually in buildings it's got a flat floor, so it does like a scan at the same level, and it uses that to correct up all the scans as it goes along. So it knows that one linear elevation scan in a room, for example, and it's constantly correcting that, to put the scan together. So, and I'm trying to build this, I'm trying to give you a perception of what this might look like someday. And have you ever seen the movie Prometheus?
Yes.
The prequel to Aliens. So
Yes.
someone me and your age think it's really cool. That's
Right.
how the Aliens movie started doing. Do you remember when they landed on the planet and they found the cave system with the ship and everything?
Right.
And they took these balls out of their pocket and they threw them up and they mapped the whole tunnels and the whole system, and it was doing like this spinning thing.
Right.
That was LiDAR. That's nothing more than LiDAR.
Really?
And those are just drones. Now they're not the drones like you see today with the props and
Wings
everything
and all
on them.
that.
but there's no GPS inside that cave, so it's using the SLAM algorithm to position itself to map those caves without any GPS. So it'll use a combination of SLAM and IMUs, and it's funny, we don't have the floating balls yet. Nobody's figured out anti-gravity, obviously. But we do have drones now that they put one of these LIDAR units on it and you can just let it go. And it goes in the cave system and it maps, and if it comes to a dead end, it stops, and it goes back, and if it finds an opening, it goes down the opening, and it knows when its battery life's getting low, and it'll come back, so.
Your little Roombas on the floor that clean your rugs.
That's the same thing. That's another example of it. That's using LIDAR.
Right.
Yes. So that's sending out light signals, and if it senses curtains or a couch, it's like, I don't go there. It's the same way they put object avoidance on drones. So if a drone goes up and it doesn't fly into that beam because it's shooting LIDAR out. So automobiles.
I was going to ask you a dumb question. They have the one now where you park your automobile and it automatically parks for you.
Yeah, so here's the rub on it. There's something called photogrammetry. And photogrammetry's probably been around since the Civil War. I think they used to do it from blimps or something. Right around that time period, they took some really old aerial images. And so by using overlapping aerials, you can create what's called stereo compilation, the collimation equation, and you can get XYZ from overlapping imagery. It's how our eyes work to figure out depth perception. Nothing more than that. So the advancement in the last few years to compete with LIDAR has been like pictures. So now you can take pictures of this room. They've all seen the real estate camera, and I'm drawing a blank on the name right now, but there's a fancy real estate camera they do this with. And so that real estate camera takes imagery and calculates X, Y, Z points just like LIDAR based on the imagery. So your automobiles probably use the good ones, a combination of pictures and LIDAR simultaneously. Because another cool thing you can do is if you use LIDAR and you get all these XYZ positions, you can also take 360-degree imagery at the same time in all directions, and now you colorize each little point. So the point on that beam is white. The point that lands on that monitor is black. So now when you look at the point cloud, it looks like what actually looking at an image. You might see it might be a little grainy, because of the density of the points, but as LIDAR gets better, and as LIDAR gets better than our human eye, we won't be able to tell the difference between a point cloud that's colorized and the real world. So what you're building is what they refer to now with colorized point clouds that are very dense. It's called a digital twin. So you ever heard the term digital twin?
No.
Have you ever heard the term avatar?
Yes.
So avatar is like your, persona built in the virtual world. But it doesn't have to look just like you. Like your avatar could be like a really tall, sexy, slim, like swimmer, like you were in college. So it doesn't necessarily
Now
be
he's
the same.
hurting me. Now he's, go ahead.
Yeah. So if we made you a digital twin, if we scanned you and took pictures and colorized that point cloud, you actually would have the exact gym in the virtual world. So I'm trying to put this in perspective for you. So if we scanned the Tampa airport, for example, scanned it and colorized point cloud, we could now build a virtual Tampa airport that if it was taken over by a terrorist group, the guys that were going to go in, like the FBI, the SWAT team, they could actually look at this virtual twin, this digital twin, and they could see every nook and cranny that we've scanned. So they could see, well, the terrorists are here, we'd be right above them if we were here, and they could figure out ways to go, obviously, and rescue people and stuff like that. And so people don't realize this, but LIDAR and imagery together are really building the virtual world. So someday I have a feeling our entire planet will be in 3D, all mapped virtually, colorized. And so whether you're here or in virtual, and you may say, well, what's the big deal? Well, industrial plants are doing it now, for example. So we could make a digital twin of your industrial plant, scan it, colorize it. We could even add information. So now you have a burner in there that burns dirt. So we could actually tag that with a database that if you've been here for, I'm taking 30 years. So you know the ins and outs of everything. But someday, Jim, you may want to sit on a beach somewhere and not be here every second. So we could take the information that you had, when the burner was installed, when it needs to be repaired. We could have videos of shutdown, startup procedures, and when I said repaired, but when it needs to be replaced and pulled, any safety issues. So if somebody could go in this digital twin, click around, say, oh, well, that was installed in 1991 when they built the place, and it goes offline in whatever year. They don't need you right here. Also, you could sit on your computer at home and the guys could call and say, man, we got a problem. You could be looking at the digital twin when they're telling you what's going on, and you could be saying, well, this is obviously not working, and so forth. It's a complete digital representation that you can pull distances on, you can measure, you can navigate through it. So one aspect is again, scanning an airport, and when you get off a plane, you open up your app, and it says, well, you're right here in the digital twin, and the quickest route is here, and it navigates you through the digital twin. And you can actually, I mean, it's endless, because you could have stores that you could walk
sitting
through.
here, the first thing that comes to mind is somebody's in a wheelchair in a hospital. He'll never be able to walk again, but he wants to go to Venice in Italy. He can put that on like the virtual.
That's exactly right.
And he could go through and see all Venice, France without leaving where he's at.
Correct. Now you gotta remember, we're in the early stages. So right now, it might be just a headset. But years from now, you might actually lay in a pod that may give you temperature control. You may have other sensations, like you could have water against. You've been to movie theaters like Disney where they spray water when Stitch sneezes or something.
Yes.
So we're in the ground stages of virtual reality. So how far that goes, none of us here today know. In 100 years, we might be amazed at what they're doing. But it really is. I mean, LIDAR is so much more than just topography for a surveying company. Robots, they will see and sense with LIDAR and imagery and combine the two. So they'll have exact, if a robot was in this room, he could tell you the exact distance and orientation to that clock quick, because he's got LIDAR and imagery sensing it, so he'd be able to precisely within millimeters know that.
I see the AI, or the robots, et cetera, will be using that. And God knows you've seen all the science fiction shows where AIs take over and all that. Well, let me ask this. Here in Florida, because I know you guys have grown like leaps and bounds. I mean, just unbelievable. What's your main thing in Florida that you do using LIDAR, et cetera? What do people ask you for?
Well, anytime you're doing topography, so they want to know natural ground below vegetation, or it's just a really big area that's hard to reach. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen the mines, but after they mine, it's torn up before they remediate. It's very hard to survey, So LIDAR is extremely good for that because it's a lot of up and down topography. So the mining companies use it. The DOT uses it for pavement, for roadways, all your municipalities. In fact, I'll go a step further. NGS, or USGS, I'm sorry, United States Geological Survey, is basically on a mission to perform LIDAR on every inch of this country. So we flew 3,500 square miles in Maine last year, Mount Katahdin, which kind of was full circle for me and Stacy because we're both from Maine, and that's the biggest mountain in Maine, and we got that contract as a sub on a USGS job. But I think they have Florida 100% mapped in LIDAR right now. Oh yeah. So, and I don't have their website off the top of my head, but if you go out there and Google, Florida LIDAR, there's servers on the internet right now where you can go out and circle an area and say, I want the LIDAR data for that area. So that's already in existence, and they've done that as a government service because what do we here in Florida? We're very flat. Yeah. So when it rains, what happens? We flood very easily. LIDAR is extremely powerful for drainage because you get every nook and cranny. So when these guys model the stormwater basin, they're getting real life 3D models of that topography. Instead of a surveyor shooting a cross section here, which is just some shots across this and shots across this, they're just getting much denser data sets. So they can calculate their drainage problems much better, much more efficiently. So
I did cheat on you.
What? Yeah.
I wanted to learn as much as I could about LIDAR. I actually got on the USGS. Phenomenal. You go on the LIDAR and USGS, and it's like you're in another world.
It is.
You're in another world. And one of the things they were talking about over there is they will do LIDAR over a certain area, and you can watch vegetation grow, not grow, like you said, drainage problems, non-drainage problems out in the west where they had the flash floods and all that. And I got on that USGS and I could have spent hours on it.
No, you most certainly could. And you gotta remember, you're talking to a surveyor. So I care about natural ground most of the time. But if you're a tree person, you may be caring about the tree canopy for the health of the forest, and you get different intensity values back from LIDAR. It's not the same as, color, but it's intensity, which can tell you that the the intensity you get back from certain crops or leaves can actually tell you the health of that crop or that plant or that forest. So even though we're using it for purely measurement type things, because we're mappers, I mean, there's so much more that can come from LIDAR data sets. And there's, scientists and environmental folks working on that every day, which is way past what we do. But it's almost endless. I mean, when you look at the possibilities of mapping this planet, the one thing that I do think is interesting, we have much more ocean than we do land.
Right.
So they're actually working on right now using different types of sonar mapping the ocean in 3D because there's just so much of it.
All we're looking at right now is the fires out in California. They can find out where the damage, how much damage, do we cut back too much, do we not cut back enough, what happened?
Well, and this is from purely a survey point of view, but you know what your property boundary is.
Yeah.
And so your ownership. Well, years ago, I never forget, I read an article on when they had extremely bad forest fires in California. And I think it was probably 2 decades ago, but I mean, it burned intense. It burned so bad that they couldn't tell where anything was previously. So, having LIDAR that shows natural topography, that what the ground was like and you can compare. I mean, now with state plane coordinates, a lot of stuff is already mapped, so it's not as big of a deal, but there's just so many avenues for using LIDAR data. I think that's why you'll find that all your counties, cities, municipalities all have LIDAR data in their data sets. Now, here's the interesting thing. LIDAR probably would have been developed many years ago, because you heard me say they started this in the 60s.
Mm-hmm.
But what have we just recently grown in the past couple decades? Computing power and bandwidth.
Got it.
So when we do one little, I want to say our first LIDAR job, we flew, man, it must have been around, 15,000 square miles with our first aerial LIDAR sensor about 3-4 years ago. And the very first job was 60 terabytes. So not only do you got to store 60 terabytes, you got to get 60 terabytes from the airplane back to the office. You got to do processing, classification, then you got to get it to a client. So in the early days of LIDAR, back in the 90s, power companies and municipalities would say, man, that looks cool, I want you to fly this. And they fly a utility corridor with all the transmission lines, and then the utility company would get it and they couldn't do anything with it. The computers couldn't handle it, the software wasn't there, the bandwidth of moving data back and forth wasn't there, so they just put it on the shelf on a hard drive. So,
Wow.
yeah, in the early days it was very temperamental doing any type of LIDAR, whether even ground-based LIDAR. If I was to scan this room in the early days, it would probably be a few gigabytes. Well, you remember, it wasn't that long ago when none of us knew what a gigabyte was.
Right.
I mean, I want to say when I started SurvTech, I know in probably 2000, early 2000s, I mean, to have a 6 gigabyte hard drive was a big deal. It was a big hard drive. And so look at how fast storage is slowly crept up, and speed of access in that storage. Because LIDAR data is very intensive. You're dealing with millions and billions and billions and billions of points.
What do you see for the future, especially for you guys? What do you see in the future as far as, this could be endless. Things we've talked about today. What do you see in the future for this?
Well, we've actually, we talked to municipalities. We went to New Orleans and they were very interested in the indoor LIDAR for emergency response. And I was like, really? And they said, yeah, like if we have a 25-story hotel, somebody calls up and said they're having a heart attack, but they can't tell us what room they're in. So now they say that people show up and they search room by room trying to figure out where that person is, if they didn't get his name, for example. But if they had that building built in 3D in a virtual realm, they told me, and I didn't know this, they told me that cell phones are accurate enough to tell them what elevation they're at, so they would actually see what floor and what part of the building in the hotel they were. They said they could get that from the cell phone data, and I said, really? And they said, yeah. So if you scan these bigger buildings for us, and someone calls, not only would we know what address they're at, we know exactly where they are in the building just from their cell phone. Think about that for a minute. So, if your wife wants to find you and you're hiding in the bedroom, she call 911. She may come find you faster.
We're cutting this part. We're gonna cut this part right out.
But
Wow.
so I think you'll see. And we all talk about this, and I talked about it earlier. You'll see industry embrace it because having their factories, well, they already are. The auto industry is embracing LIDAR, having their factories in digital twins already. You'll see that really take off. That'll allow robotics, so it may displace a lot of the workers at a warehouse if everything's in 3D and the robot knows where everything is and everything's barcoded. Now their whole world for the robot is mapped out. So it's taken care of. So you'll see it in industry, you'll see it in emergency response, you'll see it in government structures, you'll see it everywhere. The latest iPad, does anybody have the latest iPad? Is Clack bought one for one of their employees?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
So the latest iPad has LIDAR. So you can
Does it
turn it,
really?
yeah, you can do LIDAR in the room. Now it's not as accurate as obviously the survey grades we have, but you can do LIDAR with the latest iPad, yes. And take imagery and overlay the two. So the big guys are thinking about this. Apple, Microsoft, Google. I think there'll come a time when not only can you buy something from a store, but you can, with a virtual headset on, maybe go grab it off the store shelf and throw it in your virtual cart. If you think about that. Because you got the digital twin, and they may have scanners in the corner of the room, LiDAR sensors that are constantly updating. Because LiDAR is very good at movement. Have you ever played Xbox Connect with your kids?
No.
That's nothing but a LiDAR sensor. So when you're dancing to, I don't know what the dancing game is, but you're trying to do the worm on the floor.
Okay.
Xbox Connect is sensing your movement and mapping you in real time.
I've played the Xbox Dance.
There you
You
go.
gotta have the thing in your hand and it shows, you've gotta move.
Now, if you're gonna
with
have a thing in the hand, I don't know, but the one that I played years ago, you didn't have to have a thing in your hand. So, but it had the little bar, and that's actually LiDAR.
Right,
sensors.
and it looks at you.
Yeah, and that's it, sensing your movement as you go in real time, pretty fast. So all that's going to be part of our world. There's going to be digital twins of everything: automobiles, buildings, people, everything.
First thing coming to my mind on that too was there's a show called Player One. And Player One was about how everybody got into a digital world. And they had to find these golden keys to win the prize.
Yep.
And that's all it was all digital world. You put on the set, you got hooked up on wiring and all that with the suit.
Yeah, so the difference is one might be a completely fake built digital world, while the other might be a digital twin, which is based on a real world somewhere.
Some LIDAR and video.
Yeah, they've imaged it, they've LiDAR'd it, they've built it in 3D with the exact dimensions. So yeah.
Wow. Dave, from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank you for coming here.
I can talk about LiDAR all day.
This is something, like I said, it all started with I watched a National Geographic show, and it was about the Mayans and all that, and Dave and I kicked things around about the water, and hey, why can't I use it to find fish when I go fishing, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But right now, I had no idea that the digital twin world, et cetera, people that are hospital, that are bedridden, all that, they have a life that they can at least experience with their mind.
No, I think you'll see it grow and grow and grow, because you got to remember right now the world seems extremely large. So when you think about mapping the world in its entirety, it seems like a big deal. But as technology grows and more people do it, it's like no one would have thought that USGS would map the entire United States, but they're pretty much there. I think they're probably almost complete by now. And so if they're not complete, they're very close. But so I think it's funny how exponentially things change. So I think probably less than 20, 30 years, I think the entire planet will be pretty much mapped, and you'll see it being mapped in real time. So not only will it be the structures are mapped, you'll have LiDAR sensors. When someone walks into the room, they'll capture that person walking into the room. You got to have the broadband to push that data back and forth all around the planet. But 5G, we're getting there already. So
Wow.
yeah.
Mr. O'Brien, I want to thank you tremendously. I don't know about the rest of y'all, but this has been eye-opening for me with AI, with what it can do, where it can show and all that.
You're welcome.
Thank you,
glad
David.
to do it.
I greatly appreciate this.
No, you're welcome.
If any of you have any questions, send them in to cei@clark.com. If you want to see something in the future and all that, send those in. We are going to have drawings at the end of each one of those sessions for a $100 gift card. But I want to say from the bottom of my heart, Mr. O'Brien, thank you very much. I greatly appreciate it.
I'm glad for the invite. It's always fun to talk about LiDAR.
So until next month, thank you all.